Flooding that's affected the pyramids and the Valley of the Kings, here's a second chance to see The Rape of Tutankhamun, John Ramer's timely film about the urgent need to save ancient Egypt.
This is the story of the menacing and mutilation of one of the Earth's most beautiful places. The Valley of the Kings at Thebes in Egypt, with the tomb of Tutankhamun at its centre. That's the valley down there, in the shadow behind the cliff. A desert valley, made by water, shaped by rain and flash floods. I'm standing just above the great golden coffin of the boy king Tutankhamun. His bones are still inside. Once upon a time, they were encased in two more coffins, the three of them, one inside the other. And outside of this great sarcophagus stood huge golden shrines. And over there were the gods of Egypt, again in gold and lapis lazuli. And over there were the royal chariots, the armour, the chairs, all the paraphernalia of a royal household. It was a treasure which nobody had ever even imagined. When old Egyptologists who studied the profession all their lives first came into this tomb, they left weeping. It was a vision for the world, you might say. Now, you see that? That's a rock crack that runs through the roof of the tomb. And just 2 years ago, water came in here and left 3 inches of rainwater on the floor of the tomb. And that can cause terrible damage in a place like this. Isn't that extraordinary? That's the first time since the boy king was buried here 3,000 years ago or more that such a thing happened. And you know, since then the West has done nothing about it. Now this tomb has generated millions and millions of pounds. The boy king and his golden mask has gone round the world, from Tokyo, all over America, all over Europe, everywhere. The books, the films, everything that's come out of this tomb, a huge tourist industry. Not to say the impetus behind the profession of Egyptology. All this has come from here. And yet nobody in the West seems to care about it. It's not just Tutankhamun's tomb that's falling down in the Valley of the Kings. There are 24 more royal tombs running off these desert paths. And many of them too are moving and cracking. This, for example, is the great tomb of King Seti I. This is King Seti's burial chamber. On its ceiling is the finest of all Egyptian zodiacs. The Sistine Chapel, you might say, of ancient Egypt. The constellations of the night cover the mummy of the dead king. "15 years ago, I predicted that a part of this ceiling would fall down. 2 years ago, as the result of an archaeological excavation in the chamber, it fell, hit the floor and smashed to pieces. It's been glued back up now, but it'll never be the same." Well, just how much of ancient Egypt is closed for restoration? The struggle to save the Sphinx, of course, has been international news for years. The rest of the problem, though, isn't quite so well known.
At the Temple of Komombo, for example, underground water is weakening the columns and the walls. In the 1992 earthquake, huge blocks fell down from the ceiling and smashed onto the floor. So far, Western Egyptologists who have worked here for so many years have done nothing to help. With thousands upon thousands of monuments to look after, for the most part, the modern Egyptians manage alone. It's an unequal struggle. The world-famous Temple of Luxor, yet another monument that for years has been held inside a massive scaffolding. Western Egyptologists are watching it crumble as they work. Do you think that foreign Egyptologists are doing enough to help the monuments of Egypt?
I think foreign Egyptologists have done very little to help us to restore and to maintain the heritage of ancient Egypt. They let for us to bear the burden alone in restoring and maintaining the monuments they excavate themselves.
But why should we help the Egyptians to save these peeling ceilings and these cracking walls? Well, there's several good reasons. Places like this, the tomb of King Ramesses VI, are as an important a part of our planet as its birds and animals. These starry ceilings stand at the beginning of the modern world. They help us understand ourselves. So these paintings, then, really have a lot of the modern world in them. But there's more to them even than that. There's a lot here, too, that tells about delight, about skill and excellence, and above all, about human dignity. It's not just the insides of these tombs that are so precious. The valley itself has spaces in it as old as human history. Some of the first Christian monks of all lived in this place. And 30,000 years before them, Stone Age people made arrowheads and axes on the self-same hills. These white paths were made by the craftsmen and artists who made the royal tombs, and they were here, generations of them, until about 1000 BC. Walk down these pathways then, and you walk with the tomb makers. These are Pharaoh's pathways. When I first came into tombs like this in the Valley of the Kings in the 1960s, you really felt nothing much had changed since the days of the pharaohs, really. The valley was very quiet in those days. This is one of my favourite tombs, the tomb of Thutmose IV. I suppose it was in here that I first started to notice these cracks. Huge cracks, displacing whole bits of relief, whole bits of painting. You could tell they were new, because the plaster that had been moved was hanging on by its eyebrows. It used to flap in the breeze. Sometimes you could see it fall off. Several of these in the valley, and I suddenly started to think something new is starting to devour these tombs. These cracks, and they're in Seti's tomb and Tutankhamun's as well, show that the very rocks of the valley, the rocks on which the scenes of the tombs are painted, have suddenly started to move. The question is, are these cliffs falling by themselves, or is something pushing them? Now, contrary to popular belief, things don't fall down just because they're old. Something has to push them. Well, there's been no rock blasting here, no wars, no flash floods for a while, and no earthquakes here either. Now, these cliffs were made by floods and rain. After a couple of years of research, it seemed to geologists that water was the only thing powerful enough to split the royal valley and its tombs.
These cliffs are made of limestone. And limestone, when water touches it, expands. And that makes it split. Now this stuff underneath, this here is even worse. Right across the valley runs this grey shale. This shale, well, it's like a sponge. It sucks water, and it expands so violently that it actually disintegrates. Imagine what that does for the limestone at the top. All the tombs are standing on this stuff. Water hits them, bingo, they all fall down. Look, I'll give you a graphic demonstration. Here's a lump of shale. Pour some water on it. Look at that, it's just fallen into dust. Just imagine that. Under these beautiful limestone cliffs lays a layer of stone, something like soluble aspirin. This is what happens when water gets into tombs. You see, just under my feet is shale. The walls, the beautiful white walls are limestone. What's happened is that this water has driven in with piles of sand, soaked the shale's gone straight up into the air, jammed this column up into the roof, and it's stayed there perhaps for a century, and then slowly the room has dried out. The mud's dried out. These bits here are bits of the column that have fallen hard on top of the mud. Look at that crack, that great long crack around the walls. It's classic textbook stuff. The room itself has actually dropped, and the ceiling's hanging like a great limestone cavern in the mountain. Now, what our geologists said in situations like this, it is absolutely critical to maintain levels of humidity in this room so that it can dry very, very slowly, so that it can be controlled. The worst possible thing you can do is to get an archaeologist in here and dig it all out.
So, okay, after it comes flooding through the door, water can really mess up a royal tomb. But look at this wall again. No water's ever been in here. This wall's dry and clean, and it always has been. So what suddenly split the rock behind it?
In the end, this turned out to be the culprit. Inside this concrete is a pipe. That pipe used to come from a rest house over there. And down it for 25 years went water from the cafeteria and the lavatories. Now, everybody thought it went into a sealed cesspit, but it didn't. For 25 years, this pipe had leaked into the shale, and that was pumping up part of the valley and causing the fractures in the tombs. The whole place was on a knife edge.
All that research was done by an expedition I led in the 1970s. We recommended that the rest house and its septic tank should be closed. If something was not done soon, we said, the monuments of Thebes would be just a memory. The Egyptian government agreed, and the septic tank was demolished. Other work was done too. By the 1980s then, the valley seemed to be safe from immediate damage. Well, not completely safe, of course. There were still hundreds of gallons of water trapped deep in the rock. Then, Late in the 1980s, several Western archaeological expeditions started to excavate again. So that water trapped in the rock might be evaporating faster now and shrinking and cracking the tombs. Nowadays, the first thing you notice are huge new piles of excavation debris. When the flash floods come again, these will trap the floodwaters and send them into nearby tombs. The second thing you notice is that there are just more open tombs than there used to be, 20% more in fact, and any one of them could have opened a new path to that moist shale underneath. This tomb gives us special cause for concern. What you're looking at is the beginnings of an American excavation that is planned to go on for quite a long time. They're digging close to what was probably the source of the recent trouble in the valley, the old rest house septic tank. In another part of the valley, a German excavation was digging out a recently flooded tomb. Even as they excavated, they told me, pieces of stone were falling from the walls and ceiling. Imagine that. This dark, wet flood debris from inside the tomb is being dumped straight out onto the valley floor. This is a newly opened crack. And it's right next to another excavation. It runs up the wall, across the floor here. It's so big here, you could post letters down it. And then it runs up the wall. This old crack's opened up so much here, the bits have actually dropped off in the last few months. Now, what's causing this crack? This is right in front of a beautiful tomb. Well, let's chase the crack some more. At the end of it is a big tomb. One recently dug out by an American expedition. They've taken a lot of sand out of here. And what's happened is they've broken the atmosphere, the ceiling in this tomb, and the lovely hot air from the valley has rolled in and it's starting to suck and dry the rock out. And that, I think, is what's causing the crack to open. That tomb was excavated by a team led by Dr. Donald Ryan of Pacific Lutheran University. He's researching small tombs. Unfortunately, the newly opening crack is just yards away from one of the finest tombs in all of Egypt. The essential quality of Egyptian art is its intensity of observation. In its masterpieces, even the hieroglyphs, an arm, an animal, an eye, a face, have pulse and breath. In the twinkling of an eye, inanimate things are reduced to their essentials. I went to meet Dr. Ryan to see what he had to say about the excavations. Recently, in the Valley of the Kings, we've seen old cracks in the tombs widening, and we've seen completely new cracks appearing as well. Now, some of this seems to be related to archaeological activity. Now, you've been digging in the Valley of the Kings. How do you feel about that?
Well, if that's indeed the case, then I think it's a matter for great concern. As you know, there's a number of different variables that might contribute to damage in the Valley of the Kings. And as you well know, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly which activity, whether it's natural or the result of excavation, that might be responsible for a given crack or widening of cracks in the Valley of the Kings. Nonetheless, if there are cracks that are indeed appearing at a time or in the aftermath of recent excavation, I think it's something that any archaeologist, including myself, working in the Valley of the Kings, should take very seriously and see what we can do indeed there's a possibility that we are responsible.
Look, the valley actually exists absolutely on a knife edge. The difference between the tombs collapsing and standing is a very fragile one. And yet we've got expeditions working there that are absolutely science-driven. Research, it's called, that holy title, like it was a cure for cancer or something. But it isn't, and sometimes it actually seems to be interfering with the very existence of these major monuments.
Maybe our needs for archaeological research can be addressed while we are carrying out conservation in the Valley of the Kings, and maybe the new priority indeed should be conservation first.
So how can it be then that these eminent and successful men, these members of an elderly and scholarly profession, can turn up here in the Valley of the Kings and threaten the very monuments they've come to study? Well, like most things in Egypt, the situation has a very long history. And this history is the history of Egyptology itself. For most of Western history, ancient Egypt was just an idea, just a dream, like the city of Atlantis or the kingdom of Thule. It was something magical, something the ancient Greeks had written about. The ancient Greeks wrote of the wealth of Egypt, of its great palaces and temples. The ancient Greek travelers described what it was like, yard by yard in this land. For most of European history, the whole idea was a fabulous one. All that changed in the 18th century. A Jesuit missionary called Father Claude Sicard came down the Nile in a boat, in a sailing boat, carrying Greek books. With the aid of a tape measure and these books, he was able to lay out all of ancient Egypt. He could read things like this. Now, the priests said that in their records they find 47 tombs of kings, but only 17 remain at this time. This is a Greek text. Father Claude goes to the Valley of the Kings, counts the 17 tombs, and he thinks this is what the ancient Greeks are talking about. And then the Greeks tell him, 10 miles from these tombs stands a monument of the king known as Ozymandias. And he measures out the miles and he too finds a temple. Now, Sicard was doing this for a reason. He wanted to write a geography of ancient Egypt, a book about the land. It was the beginning of Egyptology. What the Jesuit missionaries had found beside the Nile was that the ancient tombs and temples stood amongst modern towns and villages. This Theban village, for example, was built amidst the tombs of ancient noblemen. When Sicard came here, some of the finest products of the ancient world lay scattered through these hills. Just 100 years after the Jesuits had rediscovered Thebes, the European agents had invaded the entire area. Some of them actually set up house and lived here, chipping and cutting away at the monuments. This is probably the last one that remains. سيدة
سعيد أهلا وسهلا
سيدة من فضلك هنا البيت يعني بالضبط
بيت يني
أيوة.
هنا
يا سلام
وأنت تعرف يني
طيب.
من زمان هو هنا.
My friend Hamdi is telling me that this house once belonged to a Greek merchant, a thief, he said, who took many things away from here. Local memories are very long. In the early 19th century, this was the house of Yanni Athanasi, a British consular agent and dealer in antiquities. Some of the greatest treasures of the European museums once stood inside these walls. One of Yanni's favourite hunting grounds was the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings. It had been rediscovered in 1817 by one of his arch rivals, another British consular agent, the circus strongman and wild and eloquent explorer, Giovanni Battista Belzoni.
We're 100 yards underground now, right deep in the tomb. It was this little room, above all others, that came to symbolise, really for 100 years, right through the 19th century, ancient Egypt itself. It was the 19th century's Tutankhamun's tomb, if you like. They thought the colours were exquisite. When Belzoni first found it, he said it was like a rose. He drew it like that, clean, pure and white. Within a couple of years, however, it was all damaged. Floodwaters came through here and knocked it about a bit. Then Belzoni, a year after he found the tomb, took plaster casts of the walls and stripped most of the colour from it. The ceiling had fallen down too. Now, when the first travellers came through here, they had torches with them. If you notice, they wrote in soot the date of their arrival, 1820. Just 3 years after the discovery of the tomb, it was already being destroyed. 9 years later, the man who deciphered hieroglyphs visited this tomb. Jean-Francois Champollion, the French scholar, came in here and for the first time read all these signs. Now this he knew was the name of a king, this sign in an oval ring. And he read the name Seti, beloved of the god Ptah. That meant that all the faces of the king in this tomb were that famous king Sethos of the Greeks. So what did he do? He got the local lads along with saws and chisels, and they cut at the wall, and they cut this entire wall off with a beautiful portrait of the king. They sent it to the Louvre, and for the first time, but not the last, as a museum curator, they could say they were doing it to preserve the art. His buddy from Florence took the opposite wall over here. The king's son, which Champollion was also interested in taking, he actually left. It's very beautiful, and it's so touchable, isn't it? Well, it's been touchable now for 100 years, and that is a huge halo of human grease. This bit here, the hieroglyph hunters have been at it again. You see, they've been after the king's name, very nice little name, so they chiselled all around the edge and got their saw behind it, and they've snapped it off, so they left that one behind. Somebody up here has been taking casts again, all the paint's washed off. Another cartouche is missing. Another cartouche with the king's name, another cartouche. Look at this here. This one here, they even left that beautiful face. They're so keen on these hieroglyphs. They tried to get the head here, but it snapped, so they left half of it. Now, these fragments, you can find them in all the museums of the world now. That bit there is in Boston. Those 7 bits from there are in British Museum. These 2 are in Berlin. 7 have been sold at Sotheby's.
If Yanni and his friends just damaged royal tombs, they devastated private ones. They dug out their wall paintings, framed them, and sold them like pictures. This cave was once a priest's tomb, painted by Amenhotep himself, the great royal tomb painter. Before Yanni and his friends came here, Amenhotep's paintings had been famous. Now all that's left is this flash of leg in fine white linen. These are the drawings of this place before it got wrecked. There was a party going on down here, and I think the dancing girls went somewhere along here. They were going to a feast. Next to the dancing girls were the guys who made the rosé wine. They're making it, you see, by mixing the red and the white. See him sucking on the siphon? Those jars will go straight to the feast. Over there was a beautiful arch. Completely gone now. Must have looked wonderful. Gold and blue like the royal tombs Amenhotep painted. Down here went the funeral. Here are the mourning ladies, professionals, screamers who scream like kites, the ancient texts say. They went along there, quite close to where the coffins would have been painted. And next to those ladies was the little gem in this tomb, Amenhotep's own portrait. He not only painted the place, he actually organised the funeral too. The self-portrait must have gone about there somewhere.
dust now at my feet. Just behind his self-portrait was the masterpiece of the whole thing. It was Amenhotep's patron, King Amenophis I. They shared the same name. So that's all that's left of the priest's tomb now. Just a few bits of Amenhotep's painting in the case in the British Museum. But you can still see the old man at work. He's an unusual artist. Look, at the brown walls of the tomb, you can just see bits of it there. Well, he's doing something really strange here. You see, most ancient Egyptian artists paint on white, but Amenhotep, he's interested in colour. Sort of like Gauguin or Bonnard or something. And he's using that brown to bind all these colours together, and they sort of vibrate and shimmer. And they still do, even here. All these other fragments too, just filled with ancient life. The herdsman and his cows, the foreman. Little bits of Egypt, trapped in picture frames, jumping like crickets in a cage. Don't you ever feel like I do, sometimes so depressed here? I mean, you've been here all your life, man and boy, as they say, working here. Didn't you ever feel when you came to work in the morning that sometimes it was as if you were going to visit this vast warehouse full of busted bits of ancient Egypt?
Certainly not. I personally get much more of that kind of feeling in some of the ancient sites in Egypt itself, where you have the relics, the remains of massive buildings, massive monuments, which are only due to some extent to the depredation, shall we say, of collectors and archaeologists.
There's nothing here that suggests to me the fragility of ancient Egypt.
It's a very complicated problem, of course. As far as the museum is concerned, you can say, and I'm not trying to dodge the issue, that it is not the business of the British Museum to do that sort of thing.
I think it should be, you see. I think the profession needs to change direction a bit.
It's all very well for you to say that
it's presiding over its destruction. It's presiding over the destruction of ancient Egypt.
Certainly not, because it is not actively engaged in presiding over the destruction.
Well,
it is actively engaged at present in certain activities which are, in fact, enlarging our knowledge of ancient Egypt through excavation. Now, you may say excavation is a destructive activity.
Well, it is, let's face it.
Just how destructive you can see all over Egypt. As archaeologists dig out the ancient past, they choose what they want to keep of it and what to dig away. Archaeology digs holes in the past. It is destructive. Perhaps these days it should only be done at sites that are immediately threatened by the modern world. There are enough of those around. But that's just a pipe dream, really. Egyptologists are driven by the demands of their profession, not the needs of ancient monuments. And nowhere can you see this more clearly than here, on the plateau at Saqqara.
That building just behind me there, about a mile back in the desert, is the first major stone building man ever made. The Step Pyramid. The father, you might say, of world architecture. Now this miserable sand pile at which I'm clambering is its direct ancestor. The father of pyramids. What the British actually found here, was an extraordinary little building. It was only a couple of metres high, and it had 7 wonderful smooth steps on it, and it had laid under the sand for 5,000 years. So they took the sand away. There was a doorway there, a passage leading down. The king's burial chamber was here. The granaries for the royal spirit were here. They mapped it. They planned it. They photographed it. They wrote several magnificent theses about its place in Egyptian architecture. But they didn't bother to protect it. And it's just slithering, as you can see, straight back into the sand again. Now, they'll tell you that their science is to do with those books and plans and photographs. But look, this isn't an imperative science. It ain't a cure for cancer. It's just what people do this year. In 100 years, all those wonderful records will seem completely out of date, and they'll come back and look for the monument, and it'll be gone.
For graduate students, work like this is a step up the academic ladder. Western universities call it field work. I worked as an artist on this expedition, the University of Chicago expedition, for years and years. In an odd hour, I once calculated that one of these drawings, which are very labour-intensive, cost more than one of Rembrandt's. The wall that's being recorded here, with such tremendous care and at such vast expense, this self-same wall is slowly slipping away from us, slowly moving and disintegrating.
So I should probably add that. So the right side goes into that pock just to the left of the end of the animal tail, and it's uncarved above.
The problem is that in the early 1970s, piped water came to Luxor town in a big way. Unfortunately, drains didn't. Like 100 other Egyptian temples, the ground under the Temple of Luxor is permanently wet. Like huge lamp wicks, the ancient stones soak up this groundwater. The University of Chicago has been working here since the 1970s. Dr. Peter Dorman is the expedition director. So what's the condition of the Luxor temple today?
Well, today Luxor temple is not in very good condition at all. Especially the portion of the temple we were walking through, the colonnade hall, which was decorated by Tutankhamun, is in very poor condition.
So whilst you've been drawing these things, they've actually been crumbling away.
Yes, the survey has been working in Luxor Temple for a good many years, and in the time that we have been looking at these reliefs and documenting them in a very careful fashion, we have noticed that certain stone blocks are gradually disintegrating before our eyes.
So one day, and perhaps quite soon, there'll just be you and your books and no temple.
That's very possible. That's very possible. It's a very insidious, slow process. It's very hard to predict exactly when we will lose the majority of these reliefs.
Do you never get frustrated? Don't you ever feel that you want to throw your drawing board away and just going and propping the temple up?
Well, right now we're engaged in what we think is a very important process of documentation, and in fact we look upon this as a conservation measure.
So you actually end up with a set of volumes which will actually serve the international community of Egyptologists.
That's right. Our volumes include careful translation and commentary on the texts, but the chief glory are the large fold-out plates, which show in as much detail as possible the reliefs on these temple walls.
This is something I've noticed before, that for the profession, ancient Egypt is becoming a book, in fact.
Well, that is correct in a sense, but I think it's perfectly acceptable. Archaeology is nothing unless the results of the archaeological work are published. Otherwise, it's just lost to science.
So there are actually expeditions working in the field, recording things that are falling down and calling it conservation.
In a sense, yes.
And I think that's outrageous.
No, it's not outrageous. You're oversensitive. I'm not saying that we are not interested in conservation. We are. What I'm saying is we have to have priorities. We will conserve what we can in the conventional sense of conservation, people trying to stop the decay. Certainly we will attempt to do that. But with a country as rich as Egypt is in archaeological sites, you can't conserve everything.
Oh, so you are actually conservation driven at the end of the day. You wouldn't open a site unless it was actually endangered.
Well, there's more than one way of conserving a site, and in my view, the best way of conserving a site is to document it properly, record it, and publish it.
Make no mistake about it. What these Egyptologists are telling us is that their books are as good as ancient Egypt. That's how they can honestly claim that by making more books, they're helping to preserve the past. There was a time, a while ago, when the world cared about ancient Egypt, cared about its survival, not in libraries or in museum cases, but in the living landscapes in which it had been born. The threat of a major disaster brought on this new awareness. A disaster of which this exquisite temple, the Temple of Philae, became a symbol. In the 1960s, an enormous lake building up behind the new-built Aswan Dam was drowning the province of Nubia and all its ancient tombs and temples. For the first time, UNESCO took up cultural conservation. Foreign Egyptologists went south and worked as part of an international rescue campaign. After most of the archaeology had been done, Philae Temple, the Pearl of Egypt it had been called, was still trapped inside the rising waters of the Nile. Enthusiastic now for conservation projects, Egyptologists told their governments about the drowning temple, and money and expertise was found to save it. As the Nile rose ever higher, foreign and Egyptian engineers built a dam around the temple. The water inside was pumped out, the temple was taken down, and block by block, Philae was moved to higher ground.
It's amazing to think that not too long ago, you had to come through here in a boat. And when you went under that lintel, you had to duck. But now, thank God, the temple's been conserved. It's straight, it's on good foundations. And it's a pleasure to visit it. Not like some of those sad old temples that are sucking up water and collapsing under their own weight like dying whales. Whatever happened to that urge to conserve these buildings that was really around in the 60s? The Egyptians keep reminding the West that they really need the help and cooperation if ancient Egypt is to be saved. But the professionals in the West don't respond at all anymore. You know, what's needed is that the public's fascination with ancient Egypt needs to turn into a massive pressure to help save it. Because this place, after all, really is one of the rainforests of the human mind.
Every temple in Egypt could be preserved as well as Philae. The technology to do it is readily available in the West. As groundwater rises up inside the temples, salt is bursting through the surface of the stone. The fine reliefs are peeling away like orange skins. It's happening now, and it can easily be stopped. Meanwhile, millions of interested foreigners come to admire ancient Egypt. And as they do, bumping, touching and abrading the ancient walls, they unintentionally become another part of the problem.
Now I think it's very nice to give you an idea about the temple in its origin. Cast 15 of the family, and as you see they are approaching the temple.
I bet most of these people think that these ancient places are continually monitored by experts, and that if they were in any sort of danger, Egyptologists would raise the alarm and they would be saved, just like Philae was back in the 70s. Not far from the crumbling Luxor temple, though, across the River Nile in another temple called the Ramesseum, a new type of expedition has started work. Here, too, is a new type of Egyptologist, a Frenchman working in cooperation with his hosts, a person who does not exploit the monuments in the name of science. Let's hope it's a sign of the future.
we are in Egypt, and it is necessary to have a collaboration with the Egyptians. It is the best way to make a very good work together. And for that, we have the French architect working with the Egyptian architect, the French Egyptologist working with the Egyptian Egyptologist, and it is a good opportunity for make a good work.
Suddenly discovered this, that
At the Sphinx and the pyramids, Dr. Zahi Hawass is pointing a way forward for ethical Egyptology, where it becomes part of a more humane profession, caring for entire ancient environments in the modern world.
If you go and visit Disneyland, you park your car 5 miles away from Disneyland, but you come by to the Giza Plateau, which you have one of the 7 wonders of the world that still exists until now, and you park your car in front of the pyramid. How can you feel it? How can you feel the dignity of the site? How you can feel this massive architecture of the pyramid itself?
This drive to reveal the dignity of ancient Egypt has led to plans to redesign the entire pyramid plateau.
You will leave your car in a parking lot down the plateau and walk up to the Great Pyramid. And this is how you feel it, and how you will walk until you will see yourself and feel the pyramid. And after that, you visit the Great Pyramid and the second pyramid and the boat, and you will come back walking to your car down. You will have a desert center in this area. It will be under the ground. In this center, you'll know the story of the site itself. You'll know the story of the excavations, the discoveries, the 3 pyramids at Giza. And after that, they will drive on the ring road to the Sphinx, a culture center, give a history of the Sphinx. They will leave. That's really mainly the idea of how can you preserve completely the whole site through this final site management that we are going to do.
Man fears time, the Arab proverb says, but time itself fears the pyramids. Today, though, these self-same pyramids, and all of ancient Egypt indeed, needs the succour and support of many modern sciences. Every site in Egypt is unique, and each one has its own special problems. I know about the Valley of the Kings. Let me tell you something of what that needs for its survival. First of all, some of the royal tombs demand emergency attention. Something, for example, to stop the ceiling of Seti I's tomb from smashing onto the floor within the next few years. The valley must also be made safe from flash floods. Databanks are needed too, to find out what's happened here over the last 100 years. And the tombs need monitoring equipment in them to raise an alarm if something moves. It's just a series of scientific problems, really, which in this day and age are not too difficult to solve. At the moment, though, to our eternal shame, the West is the greater part of these problems rather than a part of their solution. The Valley of the Kings is on a knife edge. 170 years of exploitation has to stop now if this place is to survive. And after all, these things are worth saving for our children, and for our children's children, and for ourselves as well.
Well, last month, Egypt suffered its most violent rainstorms in living memory. For the first time in 70 years, the Valley of the Kings was hit by a flash flood, causing serious damage to 3 tombs and soaking the shale on which the valley stands. John Ramer's appeal has now never been more urgent.